The horizon did not darken because of clouds. It darkened because of men. 80 warriors stood along the edge of Tsushima Island, their armor catching the cold light of the morning, their eyes fixed on a line where sea met sky. At first, it looked like a storm rolling in, an unnatural shadow stretching across the water. But storms did not move like that. Storms did not carry banners. Storms did not reflect sunlight in flashes of steel. This was something else. This was an army. November 18th, 1274. On the quiet shores of Komoda Beach, 80 samurai prepared to face a force so vast it seemed unreal. Thousands upon thousands of Mongol warriors were approaching, carried across the sea by an armada unlike anything Japan had ever seen. And those 80 men already understood something that would soon become undeniable. They were not there to win. They were there to delay the inevitable. They were there to die. But the story of that day does not begin with swords clashing or arrows flying. It begins years earlier, with something far quieter. A letter. 7 years before the first Mongol soldier set foot on Japanese soil, a messenger arrived carrying a document sealed with the authority of the most powerful empire on earth. The ruler behind that seal had conquered vast territories, bending nations to his will with overwhelming force. Kingdoms that resisted were erased. Kingdoms that submitted survived. The pattern was clear, and the message delivered to Japan was just as clear. Submit peacefully, acknowledge the authority of the empire, and be spared. Refuse and face consequences that history had already proven would be absolute. It was not a negotiation. It was a warning disguised as diplomacy. Japan had a choice: bend like so many others had done before, or stand firm and risk everything. What they chose shocked even their enemy. They said nothing. No reply was sent. No ambassadors were dispatched. No tribute was offered. The letter was received, read, and then ignored. Complete silence. At first, the Mongols assumed delay. Perhaps the message had not been understood. Another letter was sent. Then another. Over the next 6 years, repeated warnings crossed the sea, each one more direct, more threatening than the last. And every single one was met with the same response: silence. To Japan, it may have felt like strength, a refusal to bow, a belief in their independence. But to the Mongol Empire, it was something else entirely. It was an insult. While Japan remained still, convinced that distance and history might protect them, the empire began to prepare. And what it prepared was not a raid, not a small expedition, but something far greater. In the shipyards of Korea, an enormous fleet began to take shape. Hundreds of ships were constructed, each designed to carry soldiers, weapons, and supplies across the sea. Thousands of warriors gathered, Mongols hardened by years of conquest, Chinese soldiers experienced in organized warfare, Korean troops forced into service. This was not a single army. It was a coalition built for one purpose: total invasion. They brought with them tactics Japan had never encountered: coordinated formations that moved like a single organism, weapons enhanced with poison, and most terrifying of all, explosives. Gunpowder bombs that could shatter the ground and send fragments tearing through armor and flesh. This was warfare shaped by decades of expansion, refined through countless battles across continents. Japan, by contrast, had never faced an external enemy. Their samurai were skilled, disciplined, and deadly, but their experience came from internal conflicts, clan against clan, battles governed by tradition and codes of honor. Warriors announced themselves, sought worthy opponents, and fought as individuals seeking recognition and glory. The Mongols did not care about glory. They cared about victory. And when their fleet finally set sail in October 1274, it carried more than soldiers. It carried a completely different philosophy of war. Tsushima Island stood directly in their path, a small but strategically critical location between the Korean peninsula and mainland Japan. It was the first step, the gateway, and it was defended by just 80 samurai. Their commander did not need scouts or reports to understand the situation. When he climbed high enough to see the approaching fleet, the truth revealed itself immediately. Ship after ship stretched across the horizon, too many to count, too many to fight. There would be no reinforcements, no rescue, no victory. Only a decision. They could abandon the island, escape to the mainland, and warn Japan of what was coming. Or they could stay, fight, and ensure that the warning would carry weight, paid for with their lives. They chose to stay. When the Mongols landed on Komoda Beach, the difference between the two forces became clear within moments. A samurai rode forward, following the traditions he had trained his entire life to uphold. He announced his name, his lineage, his readiness to face a worthy opponent. He expected a response. What he received instead was a sky filled with arrows. They fell all at once, without warning, without hesitation. His horse collapsed beneath him. His body struck multiple times before he could even reach the enemy line. There was no duel, no recognition, no honor in the way he understood it. The Mongols advanced in formation, shields raised, archers firing in coordinated volleys. When a samurai charged, he was surrounded, overwhelmed, attacked from multiple directions at once. It was not combat as the samurai knew it. It was execution.
Then came something even worse. A high-pitched sound cut through the air, followed by a violent explosion. The ground shook. Fire erupted. Fragments of metal tore through men and horses alike. The samurai had never experienced anything like it. Some froze. Others panicked. The noise alone was enough to break concentration, to shatter the sense of control they relied on. These were gunpowder bombs. Simple by later standards, but devastating to those encountering them for the first time. In that moment, the difference between the two sides became undeniable. One fought with tradition, the other fought with innovation. And innovation was winning. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. One by one, the 80 samurai fell. Not in heroic duels remembered in poetry, but surrounded, outnumbered, and overwhelmed. Their commander, seeing the end approaching, made one final decision. Instead of retreating or ending his life through ritual, he led a direct charge into the heart of the enemy formation. The remaining warriors followed him. It was not a strategy, it was a statement. And it ended exactly as expected. None survived. The beach fell silent, but the invasion had only just begun. The Mongols moved quickly, dividing their forces and pushing inland. Villages were burned. Those who fled were hunted. Those who were captured faced something far more terrifying than death. They were used as warnings. Prisoners were bound together, their bodies displayed on ships, visible from miles away. Some were left alive. Their suffering meant to send a message to anyone who might consider resisting. This was psychological warfare refined over decades. The goal was not just to defeat the current enemy, but to terrify the next one into surrender before battle even began. And yet, despite the complete destruction of Tsushima, something crucial happened. A messenger escaped. He crossed the sea and reached mainland Japan, bringing news that could not be ignored. This was not a small raid, not a band of pirates. This was a full-scale invasion, carried out by an enemy unlike anything they had faced before. For the first time, Japan understood the reality of the threat, and they began to prepare. But the Mongols were already moving again. Their next target was Iki Island, another stepping stone toward the mainland. This time, the defenders had heard the stories. They knew what to expect. They adjusted their tactics, using terrain, ambushes, and coordinated resistance instead of traditional charges. For a moment, it worked. The Mongols slowed. They suffered losses. But numbers still decided the outcome. Iki fell, and now the mainland lay directly ahead. When the Mongol fleet reached Kyushu, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. The samurai gathered there had learned from what happened.
They abandoned some of their traditions, fighting in groups rather than alone, adapting in ways they never had before. The battles were brutal. The Mongols pushed forward, but they did not move as easily as before. Resistance held. Night fell. And then, something unexpected happened. The wind began to rise. At first, it was just a breeze. Then it grew stronger, then violent. The sea turned against the invaders. Waves rose higher and higher, crashing into the anchored ships, smashing them together, tearing them apart. Men were thrown into the water. Ships splintered. Chaos replaced control. By morning, the fleet was broken. Thousands were dead. The survivors were treated. Japan had survived, not because they had defeated the Mongols in battle, but because of a storm. Years later, the Mongols would return, determined to succeed where they had failed.
This time, they brought an even larger force. More ships, more soldiers, more preparation. Japan, now aware of what was coming, fortified their defenses, built walls, and united their forces like never before. The invasion began again. And once again, just as the outcome seemed inevitable, the sky changed. Another storm, stronger, more destructive. It tore through the fleet, destroying ships on a massive scale, drowning thousands, leaving the survivors stranded or dead. The invasion collapsed, and this time, it would not be attempted again. Japan remained unconquered. The storms became legend. They were called divine winds, proof many believed that the country was protected by forces beyond human control. But beneath the legend, a quieter truth remained. The samurai had not defeated the empire alone. The storms had decided the outcome. And yet, the story of those 80 warriors on Tsushima endured. They had known they would die. They had stayed anyway. Whether that choice was courage or something else entirely is a question history never fully answers. But it remembers them. And sometimes, that is enough. But memory is not the same as truth, and history rarely tells the whole story the way people want to hear it. Because after the storms passed, after the ships sank and the invaders disappeared beyond the horizon, Japan was not left with glory. It was left with consequences. The beaches of Kyushu were littered with bodies, Mongol, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese alike. Broken ships drifted along the coast, smashed into jagged pieces. Armor washed ashore. Weapons lay half buried in sand and mud. The sea had not chosen sides. It had simply destroyed. And for those who survived, the war did not end with victory. It changed everything. The samurai who had fought in Kyushu returned home expecting recognition. In their world, warriors who risked their lives were rewarded, with land, titles, wealth, honor. That was the system. That was the promise. But this war had been different. There were no captured territories to distribute, no new lands to grant, no spoils of conquest. Because Japan had not conquered anything. It had only survived. The government, the Kamakura shogunate, faced a problem it had never encountered before. Thousands of warriors had fought. Thousands expected compensation. But there was nothing to give. Some were rewarded with small honors, others received symbolic recognition. But for many, it was not enough. Frustration began to grow, quiet at first, then louder. Because beneath the surface of survival, a dangerous question was forming. If the storms had saved Japan, then what had the samurai fought for? And if the gods would always protect them, then what was the role of the government? These were not questions anyone wanted to answer, but they lingered, and they spread. At the center of it all was a man who carried the weight of that uncertainty. Hojo Tokimune, the regent who had led Japan through the crisis. He had made the decisions, ordered the defenses, prepared the country for war. But in the end, the decisive moment had come from the sky, not from strategy. He had done everything right, and yet he could not claim the victory as his own. Tokimune pushed forward anyway. He strengthened coastal defenses,
ordered the construction of stone walls along key landing points, and forced the country into a state of constant readiness. Every year, as the seasons changed, the fear returned. Every distant sail could be the beginning of another invasion. Every storm could be another miracle or a warning. Japan became a nation waiting for something it could not control. And while Japan waited, the Mongol Empire moved on. Despite 2 catastrophic failures, the empire did not collapse. Its ruler remained powerful.
His armies continued to expand in other directions. To him, Japan became something different. Not a prize, not a conquest, but a problem not worth solving. The cost had been too high. The sea had proven unpredictable. And fear, even among conquerors, had begun to take root. Sailors spoke of cursed waters, of winds that rose without warning, of storms that seemed to target fleets with unnatural precision. Superstition spread where certainty once existed. No one wanted to lead a third invasion. And so, none came. Over time, the events of those invasions began to change. Not the facts themselves, but the way they were remembered. Stories were told, retold, refined. The storms were no longer just storms. They became something sacred, something intentional, a force sent to protect the land from foreign invasion. The word kamikaze was born, divine wind. It was more than a name. It was an idea, an identity, a belief that Japan was chosen, protected, untouchable. And like all powerful beliefs, it shaped the future. Generations grew up hearing the story. 80 warriors standing against impossible odds. An empire turned back by forces beyond human control. A nation preserved by destiny itself. It became part of the culture, part of the mindset. But there were details that did not fit the legend. Details that were harder to celebrate. Because not every samurai died. Some survived. And survival, in a culture that glorified death in battle, came with its own burden. One of those men had been on Tsushima. He had ridden forward at the beginning of the battle. He had followed the traditions, announced himself, charged into what he believed would be an honorable fight. And he had been struck down almost instantly. Arrows tore into his body. His horse collapsed beneath him. He fell, wounded, unable to continue. But he did not die. He was pulled from the battlefield, carried away, saved. While the others stayed and fell, he lived. And that survival followed him long after the battle ended. Because when he returned home, people looked at him differently, not with pure respect, but with something more complicated. Questions unspoken, doubts unvoiced. Why had he survived when others had not? In a culture where dying in battle was seen as the ultimate proof of honor, living could feel like failure. It didn't matter that he had been wounded, that he had been unable to continue. The story people wanted was simple. The true warriors died. So he did something unusual, something no other samurai had done before. He commissioned a scroll, a detailed, illustrated account of the invasion. It showed the chaos, the explosions, the arrows falling in waves. It showed him being struck, falling from his horse, unable to continue. It was not a heroic depiction. It was honest, because he needed people to understand. He needed proof. Proof that the enemy had been overwhelming, that the battle had not followed the rules they believed in, that survival did not mean cowardice. It meant reality. The scroll served another purpose as well. In the feudal system, warriors were rewarded based on their actions in battle. But how could someone prove what they had done when so many witnesses were dead? The scroll became evidence, a record, a claim. And eventually, it worked. He received recognition. But
the deeper issue remained: the gap between reality and expectation, between what war truly was and what people believed it should be. Because the truth was uncomfortable. The samurai had been outmatched, not in courage, but in strategy, in technology, in scale. And without the storms, the outcome might have been very different. But that version of the story was not the one that survived. People did not pass down stories about luck. They passed down stories about destiny, about divine protection, about a nation chosen to endure.
And over time, that belief became stronger than the facts themselves. Centuries later, it would resurface again, in a different war, under different circumstances. When pilots, facing impossible odds, were told they were the new divine wind, that their actions would protect their country just as the storms once had. They believed it, because the story had been told for generations. But history, once again, did not follow the story. The winds did not come, and the outcome was not the same. Looking back, the invasions of Japan were not just about battles or storms. They were about choices. The choice to ignore a warning. The choice to stand and fight against impossible odds. The choice to adapt or refuse to. The choice to believe in something greater than reality. 80 warriors stood on a beach and made their choice. They stayed. They fought. They died. They did not stop the invasion. They did not defeat the empire. But they did something else. They forced time to move differently. They delayed. They warned. They changed what came next. And sometimes that is enough to alter history. The Mongols came with numbers, with power, with certainty. They left with loss, with questions, with something they had never faced before: limits. The sea had shown them something no army had ever managed to show: that even the greatest empire could be stopped. Not always by strength, but by circumstance, by timing, by forces beyond control. And that realization stayed with them, long after the ships were gone, long after the bodies were buried. Tsushima, today, is quiet. The beaches no longer carry the sound of war. The waves move the same way they always have, indifferent to what once happened there. But beneath that calm surface lies a memory, not just of 80 warriors, but of a moment when the world changed, when two completely different ways of war collided, when belief met reality, when honor faced survival, and neither side left unchanged. Because in the end, this was never just a story about victory or defeat. It was a story about perspective, about what people choose to remember and what they choose to believe. 80 men stood against an empire. They knew the outcome. They stayed anyway. And centuries later, that decision still echoes. Not because it was logical, not because it guaranteed success, but because it represented something deeper: the willingness to stand, even when standing changes nothing. Or perhaps changes everything.